Deuteronomy chapter 13, verses 1 through 11, page 147 on the Bible. If a prophet or a dreamer of dreams arises among you and gives you a sign or a wonder, and then the sign or that he tells you comes to pass, and if he says, "Let us go after other gods which you have not known, and let us serve them," you shall not listen to the words of that prophet or that dreamer of dreams. For the Lord your God is testing you to know whether you love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. You shall walk after the Lord your God and fear him and keep his commandments and obey his voice. And you shall serve him and hold fast to him. But that prophet or that dreamer of dreams shall be put to death, because he has taught rebellion against the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt and redeemed you out of the house of slavery, to make you leave the way in which the Lord your God commanded you to walk. You shall purge that evil from your midst. If your brother, the son of your mother, or your son or your daughter, or the wife you embrace, or your friend who is as your own soul entices you secretly, saying, "Let us go and serve other gods," which neither you nor your fathers have known, some of the gods of the people who are around you, whether near or far off from you, from one end of the earth to the other, you shall not yield to him or listen to him, nor shall your eye pity him, nor shall you spare him, nor shall you conceal him, but you should kill him. Your hand shall be first against him to put him to death, and afterward the hand of all the people. You shall stone him to death with stones, because he sought to draw you away from the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. And all Israel shall hear and fear, and never again do any such wickedness as this among you.
So how many of us have either been in a relationship or known someone who has been in a relationship where it was sort of on again, off again? You know what I mean? On again, off again. Like you're together and then you're not together. Maybe you had a friend like that, and when you get together and you talk to them, you never know. Are they with so-and-so, or are they not with so-and-so? And maybe they are, but then, you know, they're probably going to break up, and then they're probably going to get back together, right? On again, off again. I have a friend who the wife called off the wedding 4 or 5 times. They finally did get married, by the way, and are happily married. But 4 or 5 times, right? On again, off again. Even in your own marriage, or even in a friendship, right? It can be kind of on again, off again. You know, like you're best of friends, and then you kind of start to go in a different direction, start hanging out with other people, but then maybe you come back to that friend, and so now you're on again, off again, on again, off again. How many of us, have ever been in a relationship that's sort of on again, off again? The question I want to pose for us this morning is that for how many of us is that what our relationship with God is like? On again, off again, on again, off again, on again, off again. Today we are continuing in our series called 10 in 3, the 10 Commandments in the third millennium. And one of the questions that has kind of been, I think, a foundational question for this whole series, a question I think that emerges, and this is where the title of the series comes from, is this question of how can something written in the second millennium BC still be relevant in the third millennium AD, right? 10 in 3, the third millennium, the 10 commandments in the third millennium. How can something that old still be relevant? And I think there are times when we read the book of Deuteronomy and we come across certain passages, they're like, aha, see that? I mean, what is going on there? That does not fit in with our modern sensibilities. You know, like, for example, stoning someone to death for evangelism. That's what it is. It's pagan evangelism. You've got this prophet who tells them to come worship other gods, right? It's kind of an evangelism. They're evangelizing, sharing their faith, trying to pull them away from the worship of God. And what does the book of Deuteronomy say? It says, stone him to death. Whatever happened to religious freedom, right? It's really stone him? Stone him to death? And it even says, if your family member, you notice this? Even if someone really close to you, a brother, a sister, a family member, and they start to pull you away, right? Stone them to death. This is the way in which we should approach somebody who is evangelizing us in pulling us away from the faith. And I think some of us just, really stone them to death? Of course, this isn't the only place where it talks about that. Elsewhere in Deuteronomy, it talks about if a man or a woman are caught in adultery, stone them to death. Now, I think many of us probably do feel very strongly about adultery, about the sin of adultery, but stone them to death? Really? I mean, maybe that made sense in the second millennium BC, but to us in the third millennium AD, it's hard for us to resonate with that. What I want to highlight, of course, is this is one of these classic examples where we have to read this passage in the book of Deuteronomy within its biblical context, and then even more so within its Christological context. In other words, the heart of the Christian faith is that we read everything in the Scripture in light of Christ. Christ is the ultimate interpreter, not just the interpreter, but the fulfillment of Scripture. But in that also, he is the key that allows us to interpret Scripture in the third millennium. And so in that context, let me read for you John chapter 8, 1 through 11. And this is a passage, I will say, this is actually a passage where a lot of critical scholars will say that this particular passage is one of the few passages in the New Testament that probably wasn't in the original manuscript. I mean, even conservative scholars will say that about this particular passage. But many will still say it's still reflecting something that happened. So I think we can still see that this is something that happened even if it wasn't necessarily in the original manuscript. But here's what it says. But Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. Early in the morning, he came again to the temple. All the people came to him, and he sat down and taught them. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery. And placing her in the midst, they said to him, "Teacher, this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. Now, in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. So what do you say?" This they said to test him, that they might have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. And as they continued to ask him, he stood up and said to them, "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her." And once more he bent down and wrote on the ground. But when they heard it, they went away one by one, beginning with the older ones. And Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus stood up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, Lord." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go from now on, sin no more." Now there is so much that I could say that emerges out of this passage. But I think what is crucial, what emerges from this particular passage, what Jesus wants to highlight here, is that no person is really in the place to judge, because we have all sinned. This is the heart of the Christian faith. We are all sinners. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And so even if somebody does deserve death, their sin deserves death, they deserve to be stoned to death, which is the case, none of us are in a place to judge them because we are sinful as well. In fact, the truth of the matter is every single one of us should be stoned to death because of our sin. In the face of a holy God, none of us deserve to be here. Do you realize that? I think if we all just started from that basic foundational principle, none of us deserve to be here. That perspective could change, I think, a lot in the way we see life. And this is Jesus' point. No one is in a place to judge, of course, other than Jesus himself, who, as we will see, extends grace. Now, we might ask then, okay, well, why then? Why is it even there in the first place, right? Why in the Old Testament, Deuteronomy, does it talk about stoning someone to death? And how can this still be relevant in some degree for us today? And I think that what it highlights for us is this. We should take sin seriously. It demonstrates the seriousness of sin. You know, one of the things we need to remember is that God's intention for humanity was never for us to die. That was never his intention. Anytime somebody dies, do you realize that was never God's intention? You go back to the story of creation. You go back and you see his interaction with Adam and Eve, and they, from the get-go, they were given the opportunity to live forever. Eternal life was the trajectory that God set them on, but because they turned away from God, this led to death. In fact, it just naturally does. If you turn away from God, it naturally leads to death because he is the source of life. In fact, the Genesis account of creation in many ways can be seen as God bringing order to chaos. That if God doesn't bring order, if God doesn't sustain order in our universe, it's just going to turn to chaos. And so when we turn away from God, then the natural course that we are on is on the path of chaos, on the path of death and destruction. So in other words, apart from God, death is naturally where your life is going to go. And so stoning someone to death just dramatically makes that point. But it's already there. It's naturally a part of what happens when you turn away from God. In Galatians chapter 6, verses 7 through 8, Paul highlights just this natural connection between sin and death. Verses 7 through 8 in chapter 6. Do not be deceived, God is not mocked. For whatever one sows, that he will also reap. For the one who sows to his own flesh will from the flesh reap corruption. But the one who sows to the Spirit will from the Spirit reap eternal life. Right? And it's using this agricultural metaphor where there's just sort of this, well, you know, if you plant a tomato seed, then you're going to get a tomato bush. Right? If you plant an apple seed, you're going to get it. That's just naturally what happens. Okay, if you sow to the flesh, if you sow to the sinful nature, well, then it's naturally going to produce death. That's just what's going to happen. If you sow to the Spirit, to you're investing your life in God, that's naturally going to lead to life. So sin naturally leads to death, and this whole stoning thing just highlights the seriousness of this. Right? And just before you thought that maybe Jesus was kind of getting soft on sin, right? Oh, he's so soft on sin. Look how he just let her go, right? Well, notice what it says here in Matthew 5, 29 through 30. This is in Jesus' famous talk, the Sermon on the Mount. I often like to call it his State of the Universe address. It's sort of his first big address in the Gospel of Matthew. It's sort of his inauguration speech. He's inaugurating his kingdom. And right at the beginning, you're going to discover that Jesus highlights the seriousness of sin. Look what he says here. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body go into hell. I don't think Jesus is soft on sin. Now, I think Jesus, in sort of typical Jewish rabbinic fashion, loves hyperbole. I don't know he's saying, you do one thing wrong with your hand, you should cut it off. I don't know if he's literally saying that. But once again, what is he doing? He's highlighting the seriousness of sin, the seriousness of anything that might pull us away from God. I think about, as a sort of an illustration of this, as a parent. When I think about my children, and when they're young and they're growing up and they're learning how the world works and whatnot, if they do something that is dangerous, that's when I tend to get the most firm. That's when I tend to get the most serious with them. That's when they're most likely to hear my firm voice, right? Like if my daughter runs out in the street, doesn't look both ways, she's going to hear the wrath of her father, because I know that action is dangerous and can lead to death. You see, all sin is like that. Anytime you engage in sin, you're playing with fire. You're running out in the street. You are headed off in a direction that, if you continue on that course, will lead to death. My question for us this morning is this: do we take our sin seriously? And I mean personally. Not do we take the sin of others seriously. We're very good at that. We're very good at identifying and focusing on the sin of others. Oh, yes, I'm very focused on sin and how terrible it is. Look at those sinful people, right? I mean, we're very good at that, seeing the sin in others. But do we take our own sin seriously? Do we take our own sin seriously? Or do we just make excuses for our own sin while highlighting the sin of others? We live in a country where there are incredible culture wars going on. And in many respects, I would suggest that the large division that's emerging in our country is coming because what happens is that one group of people minimize their sin and then really focus on the other culture's sin. And then vice versa. Then the other culture, they minimize their own sin, and then they emphasize and focus on the sins of that other culture. And the more we do that, the deeper the division comes. When we really need to get back to the gospel is that we have all sinned. There's sin everywhere. So look at yourself first. Do we do this? Do we take our own sin seriously? So no. How do we apply Deuteronomy chapter 13? No, we do not stone people to death in this regard. But we should take sin seriously. Okay, that was really just the introduction. Now I'll actually get into the passage here a little bit. But I want us to see here that this is where the passage becomes relevant. Because in highlighting the seriousness of sin, now this ancient document all of a sudden is bringing forth something for us that is very much relevant today. And so what are we doing? Well, we've been going through the book of Deuteronomy, and what we've been doing is we've been seeing how the book of Deuteronomy helps us to understand better the Ten Commandments. As we've seen, many scholars see that the book of Deuteronomy in its structure actually follows the structure of the Ten Commandments themselves. So, for example, 2 weeks ago, we looked at chapters 6 through 11, and we saw that they help us to understand better the first commandment. And then last week we looked at chapter 12, which helps us to understand better the second commandment. And today we're looking at part of chapter 13, which helps us to better understand the third commandment. And what is the third commandment? Well, let's look at it here. We find it here in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 11. It says this: "You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. For the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain." Now, what does it mean then to take the Lord's name in vain? Now, I think that for some of us, we have somewhat of a very straightforward, maybe simplistic answer to that question, and that it's that you don't swear, right? You should say peas and rice if you stub your toe. not something else. You should say, gosh dang it, those sort of things. When those words are coming out, you got to make sure you don't say certain words, right? Swearing, that's what this is about. Just don't swear. Okay, well, I think that's true. That definitely is part of what this is getting at, but it's much deeper than that. And some will say, oh, well, okay, within the Old Testament context, it's talking about not breaking a vow. So if you make a vow in God's name, right? I swear on the Lord's name that I won't do X, right? Then you don't break that vow. Okay, and that's closer. That's getting deeper to, I think, the point. But I would suggest that looking at Deuteronomy 13 in particular helps us to see that taking the Lord's name in vain, there's a broader application of this, and I would just suggest it's this. To take the Lord's name in vain is to wander from God. That's what it means to take the Lord's name in vain. It's to wander from God, to no longer take him seriously. It's a little bit like this, having an on-again, off-again relationship with God. Having sort of a flippant attitude. Well, I'm on with God sometimes, I'm off with God sometimes. You see, it's not taking his name. And it's not taking him seriously when we go back and forth, when we follow God when it's convenient, and when we turn away from him when it's not so convenient, at least in our own estimation. To take the Lord's name in vain is to not take him seriously, which leads to us moving away from him, back and forth. So in other words, to heed this command is to remain faithful to God. Remain faithful, even if others are not. And this is what emerges in verses 13, verses 1 through 3. If a prophet or a dreamer of dreams arises among you and gives you a sign or a wonder, and the sign or the wonder that he tells you comes to pass, and if he says, let us go after other gods, which you have not known, and let us serve them, you shall not listen to the words of that prophet or that dreamer of dreams. Now, as a side note here, we need to be careful here. When it talks about don't follow the dreamers, right? We need to be careful here about not misapplying that. I just finished reading a book on the Wright brothers, and they were big dreamers. And people thought they were crazy. People thought they were ignorant for spending all this time working on this thing called a flying machine when they really needed to be back doing what good, hardworking Americans do, just sticking with your job, stick with your 9 to 5, stop wasting all your time going off to North Carolina trying your silly little flying machine. Stop being a dreamer. Okay, that's not what this is talking about. Right? Deuteronomy says stop being a dreamer. No, that's not what this is getting at here. What this is talking about, these dreamers are individuals who feel like when they dream, they're hearing a direct message from God on how they and others should live, or the gods, right? In this case, they're hearing dreams from other gods or whatever. So they're hearing some sort of a divine message that then they are saying applies to everybody else. This is what he's warning them against. Don't follow these dreamers who feel like they have sort of divine sanction for the things that they are saying. And what he's saying is you need to remain faithful even when others aren't. When others are following them, when others are going in their direction, no, you remain faithful no matter what. And it goes on here, it's verses 6 through 8. If your brother, the son of your mother, or your son or daughter, or the wife you embrace, or your friend who is as your own soul entices you secretly, saying, let us go and serve other gods, which neither you nor your fathers have known, some of the gods of the peoples who are around you, whether near you or far off from you, from the one end of the earth to the other, you shall not yield to him or listen to them. Right? What this is saying again is, even when those closest to you turn away. Friends, we live in an age where people turn away from God, turn away from the Bible all the time. We live in an age where people are turning away, and it's easy to get caught up in this, whether directly or indirectly, in very straightforward ways, in more subtle ways. And what this is reminding us is, listen, just because everybody else is doing it doesn't mean that you should as well. You see, this is what it means. If you do that, well, then you're not taking God seriously. You're just going where. I remember a friend of mine, and he said this in humility. I think it was a humble way of putting it. He talked about how, he said, I think I tend to believe whatever it was that I just most recently read. I thought that was actually quite insightful, because I think many of us are more like that than we realize. He's like, I tend to just, whatever was the last book I read, then that's what I believe, right? But he said it realizing that there's probably a problem with that. Right? Be careful, right? We live in a day and age where it's very easy to get pulled away from others. And look, here's just the truth. There are prophets and dreamers like we have never seen before. I would say that we live in an age, this information age, where we are more bombarded with prophets and dreamers trying to pull us away in any number of directions. It's very easy for us to fall into this. Extremism on the political and cultural left, extremism on the political cultural right. I mean, they're extremisms and directions. I don't even know which way to point, right? You can get pulled in any number of different directions if you aren't careful. And we can feel like an expert, right? If you look into it enough and you do enough on it, you find enough information, you convince yourself that it's right, because there's just so much out there that it's so easily to get pulled away. Sometimes in direct ways that are in direct conflict with God, but other ways that are more subtle. We don't realize the way in which perhaps they're pulling us away from others. So remain faithful. This is what it means to heed that third commandment. Remain faithful even when others don't. And similarly, remain faithful even when it doesn't always make sense. You see, sometimes remaining faithful to God is not going to make sense. There are going to be times when you're going to be pulled in a direction where, boy, I don't understand why God wouldn't want me to do this. This seems to make sense, especially with all my friends, especially when my culture is telling me that this is the direction that I should go. It's really easy to start feeling like, I don't even think this makes sense to follow God anymore. I remember a professor at Denver Seminary who his focus is on apologetics, which means that he spent most of his life articulating the faith in ways that will connect with those who are unbelievers. But he said, well, one of the things you have to do if you're going to do apologetics like that is you have to really read and understand where the others are coming from. So he's read a ton of literature by atheists or agnostics or people who are attacking the Christian faith, and trying to open it, trying to understand it. And he talks about how, there are those queasy moments, he calls them. Those queasy moments when he's like, boy, they're starting to make a lot of sense, right? There are going to be times in your journey when it's going to feel like following God no longer makes any sense anymore. And this is precisely what Moses is warning against. Remain faithful even when it doesn't always make sense. And then finally, remain faithful because God is faithful. You see, actually, this final point, this is the one that makes the first 2 points important. This is the point that you need to ground yourself in. Remain faithful to God because God is faithful. Verse 10. Verse 10 starts off a little weird, but then it gets better. You'll see. You shall stone him to death. We already talked about that. With stones. Because he sought to draw you away from the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. See, what it's saying here is stone that man to death because he is pulling you away from the God who loves you. You see, we should be, I don't know if violent is the word I want to use, but we should be violently clinging to the grace and mercy of God. There should be nothing that you want to get upset, you want to get angry. It's when the grace and the mercy of God is what is under attack. You see, this is the heart of the Christian faith. Don't allow yourself to wander off in all kinds of, on different rabbit trails that you think well, this is part of the Christian faith. Get back to the center of the faith. This is the one truth that really nullifies anything anybody tries to say in opposition to the Christian faith, and that is the heart of the gospel, that we have a God who loves us, gave himself for us, is faithful to us. That is the one truth that you can rest in. Sometimes I think as Christians, the more you understand the gospel, it gives you a humility to not need to know the answer to many other things. You can just say, I don't know. I mean, I can see different sides of this. I can see why some people think this. I can see why some people think this. But you're anchored in the truth. The one thing that I do know is that the God, the creator of the universe, is faithful. And so my faithfulness to God is a response to this. Friends, there are so many prophets, so many dreamers, so many different influences that you are going to continue to come on under in this information age. Friends, Jesus, he's the one you can trust. Because in Jesus, we see the faithfulness of God. In Jesus, we see that God was faithful to us when we were not. Jesus remained faithful when his disciples turned away. Jesus, he could very easily be like, oh my gosh, I wonder if I got this wrong. I wonder if I messed this up. I mean, all of my disciples, did I really get this right? Because everybody else, they're all telling him, wait a minute, if you're the Messiah, then you need to raise up an army. That's what the Messiah does. The Messiah raises up an army that can conquer the Romans, and he's going in a completely different direction. He's like, actually, you know what's going to happen? I'm going to be crucified by the Romans. Everybody's like, what? That doesn't make any sense. No doubt, there had to be times when Jesus, the human side of Jesus, had to call into question, why am I doing this? Nobody else is doing this. Why would I remain faithful to this vision when nobody else is? And why would I remain faithful to this when it doesn't make any sense? Friends, the cross doesn't make any sense. What the cross symbolizes is this remarkable paradox, that the way in which God wields his power, the way in which God has control over all things, is not through the wielding of power, but through the relinquishing of it. Somehow, in the mystery of the universe, in the mystery of God's providence, the way in which he actually has control over all things is by giving up control. Our central symbol, the cross, reminds us that faithfulness to God is not always going to make sense. Of course it's not always going to make sense. Our central symbol is the cross. Of course following God isn't going to make sense. Jesus was crucified. Friends, what does it mean to heed this command? This command, do not take the Lord's name in vain. It means to remain faithful to God. And we can be faithful to God because he has been faithful to us. We can follow him because God alone, he is the one voice that we can trust. We now come to our time of communion. What is communion all about? Communion is an opportunity for us to exercise trust in God even when it doesn't make sense. Maybe you're here right now. You find yourself in a situation where you are being tempted to move in a direction that you know is not what God would want, but the alternative doesn't make any sense. Friends, taking communion, what this does is it points us to the reality that what did Jesus do? He died on a cross. He did the very thing that is foolishness. And that in taking the elements, what we are saying is that I surrender to that. I surrender to the foolishness of the cross. I surrender to the truth of God even when it doesn't seem to make sense, because I know that Jesus on the third day was vindicated.